Trey Brown. This is my Sports Organization Report done on the UFC. Some basic information here. The UFC stands for Ultimate Fighting Championship. It was founded in November 1993 by a man named Art Davie and Rorion Gracie. The very first logo ever for this company can be seen to the right. UFC later sold to Lorenzo Ferretta for $2 million before he sold it for $4 billion in 2016. The current president of the company is, of course, a man named Dana White. Some league structure here. The roster consists of individual fighters. They're dispersed throughout 9 different weight classes. 7 of them are for men, 2 of them are for women. Each fighter is sponsored by their camps, training facilities, and any other select businesses that decide to sponsor them. Fighters begin at amateur level, lower level companies, and they try to earn their way to a UFC contract. Usually that's the dream, based on their record and skills. Some of those companies can include Bellator, Pride, Strikeforce, etc., and the other ones you guys may know. Once in the UFC, the average schedule for fighters is about 2 to 3 fights per year, but those come with grueling training sessions in the months between, so really not too much time off for these guys. Some revenue here. For the UFC as a company, biggest source of revenue are the media rights fees, sponsorship deals, and event-related revenue, so that means ticket sales, merchandise sales, stuff like that. For the fighters themselves, the biggest source is contractual salaries. That includes 20% of the revenue made by the UFC, fun fact there, as well as their individual sponsorship deals and whatever they, of course, signed for on their contract. Who makes the most, you may ask? The more popular the fighter, the more revenue they generate. Simple there, same thing as it would be for any other sport. Most times than none, the most popular fighter is the champion, so that helps balance things out. But there are some cases in which a fighter may not be a champion, but they can still generate more than the champion would. Generate more revenue, generate more attention to the company, more than champion would, just based on their fame. Conor McGregor, a huge example of that. There are huge gaps within the UFC when it comes to your most popular big-time players making big-time money and your regular middle-of-the-run fighters, sometimes bottom-of-the-run fighters, making less than they would with a normal job, even possibly. To show the gap here, you take a look at Conor McGregor's total amount of money he made in 2015 and 2016 from the UFC through just 4 fights, totaled out to over $11.7 million. While you look at the man at the bottom of Conor McGregor's weight class through those 2 years, a man named Thiago Tavares, same amount of fights, I researched, and he only made around $100,000 from the UFC. So that just shows how big the gap can be based on not only success and skill, but fame as well. Some sources of cost here. The biggest source of cost for the UFC as a company are fighter expenses. They have been totaling out to over $19 million per event for the last 7 years. The fighters' biggest source of cost for themselves is when it comes to wins and losses in the octagon. For example, there's a base pay for each fighter for each fight, but the winner of the fight in the UFC main event typically gets about a $50,000 bonus. So losing that fight could be like losing $50,000. Some information on the ratings here. UFC has around 1.2 million pay-per-view buys per event. That's huge. Their attendance most recently averaged out to around 50,000 people per event. They've been doing a lot bigger arenas as of late. Internationally, the UFC averages around 50,000 pay-per-view buys per event as well across the world. Some financial challenges for the UFC. The biggest one would be an event with low attendance. That shows the importance of ticket sales and attendance incentives and stuff like that. Help bring in extra money for the company. An example is this: in 2020, of course, during COVID-19, UFC held private close-off events, no crowd, none of that. It was called Fight Island, and according to Dana White, this cost the UFC over $100 million. Just having no fans there for each event. Some more information here. UFC fighters have salaries we mentioned earlier, but they can range anywhere from $30,000, which is a typical middle normal class job, to about $3 million based on the athlete. There's no salary caps in the UFC, there's no drafts in the UFC, and there's no free agents in the UFC. Take a look at some info about how they do their champions. Through all 9 weight classes within the company, each one has their own respective champion. Whether or not the champions, the titles ever change hands, it's up to the champions and the challengers, of course. Challengers are chosen based on their ranking and record within the company and within their weight class. Typically, champions hold the title for over a year, well over a year most times. The longest reigning champion in UFC history as of now is Anderson Silva, who held the middleweight championship for 2,457 days, which is nearly 7 years as champion, held it from 2006 to 2012. To put in perspective how long some reigns can be, there have only been 6 middleweight champions in UFC history since 2006, including current champion Israel Adesanya. And that is the end of my UFC Sport Organization Report.